Hello and welcome to Sri Lanka 99.94 Cricket Every Day. I'm Mark Machado from the Merrily End, and I'm joined as always by Estelle Devon from the Paparay, and we are talking about Sri Lanka's first two games in the Women's Asia Cup. Sri Lanka 99.94 is your home of Sri Lanka content. We'll be dropping into your podcast feed and on YouTube and on the 99.4 app several times every week, so please do rate, review and subscribe. Thanks for joining Cricket's Conversation. A big thank you to everyone who's listened already, rated and reviewed, because last week we were top of the Sri Lanka cricket podcasting charts. But our ambitions are much bigger than that. We want to be top of the sports charts and then top of all podcast listening. And then once we've done that, we aim to conquer America and also become big in Japan at some point. So please do rate, review, tell your friends, and make sure you subscribe. Estelle, how are you doing? How's everything in Sri Lanka going at the moment?
Yeah, things are doing all right, I guess, all things considered. Yeah, we have this conversation offline. There isn't much for me to say on what's going on. Not great.
No, but you are getting excited about the T20 World Cup, which starts in about 10 days' time for Estelle. No, in about a week's time, actually. But before that, we've got to talk about the Women's Asia Cup. Sri Lanka started their campaign on Saturday, where they played their first game against India, which they lost. And then the following day, they played the UAE. We would ordinarily have recorded a kind of a post-match pod afterwards, but it just wouldn't have got out in time. So we kind of waited for both games to be played, which was probably for the better, because the UAE game was shortened because of weather conditions. So there wasn't a huge amount we can garner from that. Let's talk about the India game first, though, because I thought Sri Lanka just played kind of decent cricket. But the difference between the two sides was, I think it was so clear that one of these teams had played a lot more cricket recently and were much more well-oiled and just were more in shape as a cricket team than the other one was. And it was a team that has played cricket more frequently, being India, that were able to win it without really breaking a sweat. And Sri Lanka, to me, just looked like they'd run out of steam in the end.
Yeah, Sri Lanka has, compared to previous years, has played a bit of cricket this year. Of course, they had that massive break during the pandemic where they didn't play any cricket at all. But I was just looking through the numbers on how many games they've played this year. They've played 15 T20s during this year. But I think the crucial thing to remember is they haven't played since July. So they haven't had any cricket since then, before the Asian the Asia Cup. So that maybe had an impact. But I think when you look at the two sides, the difference in skill levels is quite apparent. And it's what we have seen in the recent past as well. Sri Lanka beat India in one game when India toured Sri Lanka, but that again was due largely to Chamari Athapattu's contribution with the bat. We didn't have that in this game. So I think the skill levels, the difference in skill was clear to be seen. They had a good start again. The spinners, like we spoke about in the tournament preview, were really good, put them under pressure, some good catching early on. But overall, I think that difference in class was quite obvious.
Yeah, I thought the fielding didn't, like, at moments, some of the fielding was brilliant, and some of the fielding, I've got to be careful how I phrase this, because I don't think the fielding was bad, but in those moments when you'd expect exceptional fielding in, these high-pressure internationals, I think that's where the team weren't quite able to stop runs being scored or to take any spectacular catches. And to me, that is something, because we know these girls can play cricket, we know they're athletic, we know they've got all this skill, but I think for me, that's where the setup is letting them down a bit. And actually, if we'd had a few warm-up games going into this, or if they were able to focus more on playing cricket and not having to pay their bills, I don't know the finances of the women's team, so maybe I'm speaking out of turn, I don't know, then maybe we could have been a bit slicker in the field and put a bit more pressure on the India team. When you look at the bowling as well, I thought some of it was absolutely fantastic, but also some of it to me just looked like they just weren't. A lot of You know, for every good ball, there was one ball that was bowled that looked to me to be out of place at top international level. And admittedly, India is a top side in the women's game, and the gulf between India and the rest of the teams in this tournament, I suspect, will be quite big. And maybe, you know, maybe Sri Lanka have only got one win against India in them, and they're waiting to use that later on in the tournament. And I suspect as they play more cricket through the tournament, they'll get stronger as well. The one thing that did surprise me about the India game is they brought Charmari on to bowl quite late on. I thought I was expecting it to come earlier on. Was that what you were expecting? Or you know, what do you have any insight into why she ended up bowling quite? I think she bowled the 15th over or 16th over was her first over in the end.
Yeah, see, the thing is, I don't think she trusts a lot of those bowlers to bowl in the death. So she does use herself in the death a lot. She does use herself in those last 8 overs a lot. I don't know if maybe she should have bowled earlier. She did end up. See, the thing is with Atapattu is when you watch her bowl, she isn't frontline bowler. She doesn't look like a frontline bowler, but somehow she manages to pick up those important wickets. I think she got Jemima Rodriguez out against India. So maybe the thinking was to kind of get her to bowl those latter overs since she's got the experience playing in much bigger leagues or bigger tournaments where there's a lot of pressure on them. So she kind of backed her experience on that occasion.
Yeah, it possibly was the right thing to do. I mean, obviously, Jemima Rodriguez had battered herself in by that stage. I think she got out after scoring 73 runs, right? So she kind of did all the damage, as it were. But hopefully, it was a learning experience. And you know, as I say, I think we'll get stronger as we go through the tournament. And now we'll have a short break, of which you'll hear about another great podcast from the 99.94 crew, or as I call it, the Kimberverse. And after that, let's talk about the game against the UAE.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
Right, so Estelle, there was a quick turnaround for the girls. They played on Saturday, then they had to play again on Sunday. Luckily, they were both at the same stadium, so they didn't have to go far to travel. We were expecting them to win against the UAE, which they did, but there was a few moments when this game looked a lot more competitive than we were expecting, right? We talked, when we did the preview episode, we talked about how maybe some of the less developed cricketing nations might actually cause a few problems. And if they did, that's really SLC. You've got to take the blame there, right? And that's what we ended up having a little conversation about on social media, on Twitter about. And it looked to me at one point like maybe Sri Lanka could have lost that game because it didn't go well when they put themselves into bat first, did it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really big problem that Sri Lanka cricket need to look at, the batting, because there doesn't seem to be any growth. There hasn't been over the last couple of years at least. I described the batting performance as painful to watch because it really was difficult to watch. And you've got times when you've got these lesser nations, or so we call them, coming up with brilliant performances and beating top tier nations. And we've seen that even with Sri Lanka on the opposite end of things, where they've been the kind of weaker side and they've gone on to beat top teams in the world. But yesterday's performance, I think, was particularly poor because if you look at that UAE bowling performance, sure, they had some good deliveries, good overs. I think some of those teams bowled really well in patches. But there was so many loose deliveries in that innings, so many full tosses that the batters just hit straight at the fielder or got a single even beyond the 15th over. So I think those things are kind of inexcusable. We can talk about how Sri Lanka hasn't had um, much cricket over the last couple of years. They are not, and I will say they don't get the amount of support they need to compete with some of the top nations like India, Australia, England, whatever, right? And that's why even the loss against India, we don't take it that hard, right? I don't think the team also takes it that hard. But when you put in a performance like that against the UAE, which, let's be honest, is not one of the best teams in international cricket at the moment. Basically, if I heard the commentary team right, average age of 20, which also includes the captain who is 30 plus, right? So basically, you're playing a team that most of them are just teenagers. To put in a batting performance like that is just poor. You have to admit that. And I think Atapattu also spoke about it in the post match. You can't have a team depending on one player to get all the runs for you. And that's what Sri Lanka has been doing for the last couple of years. So maybe, I mean, this is a topic maybe we can talk about later as well. Is it time to move on from some of those batters in the lineup? Because you're seeing people who've been playing for 5-6 years who aren't really doing anything. And I mean, I don't want to get personal or pinpoint any single player. But for example, right, I'm looking at the numbers for Hasini Pereira. She's 27. She's played 88 international games, averaging 14 in ODIs and 11 in T20s, batting in the top 3, right? So how long before we say, okay, we've given her enough opportunities, we've given her enough time? And she's not the only one. There are a couple of players like that in there. So my thinking is, sure, you're not getting enough support from SLC, but that performance is not excusable. It's not something you can blame solely on them not getting enough cricket. I think there needs to be a relook at, do we want to continue with these players who are maybe who you can't maybe play for the next 5 years, or do you want to look at younger players? Because that's something I noticed was, if you look at the approach of players like Malsha Shehani, Kaushini Nutyangana, who's playing her debut, by the way, it's a complete contrast to some of the senior players in that lineup, Anushka Sanjeevani, Nilakshi De Silva, who've shown improvement over the last couple of years, but just aren't putting up the performances that you need from them at this international level. And I think you touched on the fact that it didn't look like cricket of the international standard at some points. So definitely something to think about. I don't know if you'll agree with me on the fact that, like, the blame is not solely on the fact that they haven't been playing, but yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I it's tough, right? Because if you've not been playing in a long time, if there's large gaps between it, I think I think part of the conversation we have around the women's side is we've got to take away this idea that you've got to judge the women's team and what the men's team have achieved in the past, right? Because even when you go back to the early stage of Sri Lanka cricket, there was a lot more enthusiasm just within Sri Lankan society for the men's team, and there's a much longer history of men playing any form of structured cricket than there is in Sri Lanka. And we've also talked about how everywhere else in the world there seems to be a huge amount of resource and effort pouring into making not just women's cricket, but women's sport in general a much more accessible thing, a much more popular thing. And I just think we've been too reliant on, we're Sri Lankans, it doesn't matter what gender we are, we'll go out there and in the big tournament we'll do all right. Sri Lanka will probably stumble into the semi-finals of this tournament, right? But actually, in a way, that's almost like the worst thing I think that can happen for them, because it won't, when they come to review it at the end, if they get knocked out of the semi-finals, then everyone will go, well, that's kind of, we probably are third or fourth in the region, and we've for the resource and what we put into it, we've done all right, we've done our place. when actually, if the ethos that they bring to the men's game and that we all have for the men's game, if you're in any which way, part of the Sri Lankan cricket universe, is we've got to go out there and we've got to go and try and find something that's going to give us an advantage, be it innovation or a special player from somewhere, or pushing the rules to the ultimate max, or looking for something somewhere that we can that will take us and get us those wins against the much bigger cricketing teams like your Indias and your Englands and your Australias, right? Well, I just think at the moment the attitude seems to be that we're Sri Lanka, we're going to finish fourth in this tournament, maybe third if we beat Bangladesh, and that's enough for where we're at now. And I wonder if that's filtering into the players as well. It's interesting, right? Because if you compare and contrast it to what's happened with the men's team in the last kind of 18 months or so, where kind of, I'm sure people in SLC would try and take credit for this, but I'm not sure how much of it was by design. But they got rid of a lot of the senior players, and a young bunch came through, and they brought a fresh new attitude to it, and brought the right attitude to win T20 games, right? With the right intent in their batting. And maybe that's what we need with the women as well. Maybe we do need a clear out. I mean, I think it would be harsh for some of these girls because, during COVID, the Sri Lanka women's team practically disappeared. There was no mention of it anywhere. And maybe if they do finish third, or if they manage to get to a final this time, it could ignite SLC's passion for the women's game, and we could see a Women's Lanka Premier League.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on the fact that there needs to be a plan, right? There needs to be some kind of objective you want to achieve, right? At the moment, it seems like they're happy to just have a team exist. No, we won World Cups in the men's side of things. We've had some really good performances on the women's side of things occasionally. We're happy to have a team. That's why I mentioned about, maybe it's time to move on from some of those players, because at least now, if for example, you take the UAE side, I mentioned the ages, right? I don't know whether it's by design or that's how things have kind of worked out, but the 2023 Under-19 World Cup is coming up in January. And many of those players are going to qualify to play that competition. So have they brought in a side to this Asia Cup thinking, right, we're not going to win the championship here. We don't really have a chance of winning, but let's build towards that tournament. Let's make sure we go to South Africa and we can compete against the top countries, the teams that we wouldn't be able to compete at the senior level, right? So that, I think, is, I don't know if there is a plan like that in Sri Lanka cricket, where that's why I mentioned about the younger players, right? Maybe you take a gamble and you play a few young players, see how they go. At least they're gaining experience which they can use in the next 5-10 years, right? Rather than having some of the older players. And I know a lot of people criticize the likes of Inoka Ranavira, etc., because she's in her mid to late 30s, but she's been performing. She's been getting wickets, and she's been kind of keeping Sri Lanka in games. Same with Oshadi Ranasinghe also. So those players I don't really mind having in the side because they're contributing something. But when you look at the batting side of things, you're not getting runs out of them, but you continue to play them. So what is the kind of, what do you want to achieve? That's the question.
I also think with the women's players in Sri Lanka, is I don't think a lot of them have been given the opportunity to really lead into being a professional sports woman, a professional, make sport their profession. Because I think that with, I've been lucky enough to, over the years, to work with and be friends with a number of professional footballers and rugby players and a few cricketers as well. And there comes a moment when, in all of their lives, when they realise that actually, they live and die on their performances, and they live and die on whether they're involved in teams that win or teams that lose, and that's going to dictate what their finances and what goes on, what happens in their lives. over the next few years. And because of that, they adapt to it. Almost every aspect of their life is about trying to get a good performance, be it for 90 minutes on the weekend or playing a test match or playing a T20 game or 80 minutes in rugby or whatever. And I just feel that the setup that Sri Lanka have around now, around too many of the women, and also I think some of the older players as well, older men's players, isn't really, getting the best, isn't able to get the best out of them as professional sportsmen and women. But I do see down the track, you see it with the younger players, that they want to have that attitude. They want to be able to make that step up. They want to have that mentality mind shift. They want to be able to, really think about performance. Where I just think, particularly around around some of the older women, that maybe that attitude is still, isn't it great that we're playing for Sri Lanka? Not right. It's not just good enough to be in Bangladesh. We've got to go out and win this whole thing. Like I think their counterparts on the men's side have, right? They know it's, we're gonna in the next few days we're going to start talking about the T20 World Cup in Australia, the men's T20 World Cup. We're going to talk about expectations for that. It's not just good enough for them to be in Australia. They've got to go out and make an impression over there.
Yeah, I think that's why franchise league cricket is so important. I think more important for the women than the men, because okay, you're a young girl, you're 15, 16 in Sri Lanka, you want to make cricket your career, right? But okay, you may not get the kind of resources that you need to be the best in the world from SLC, or you have a doubt about it. But you still have something to gain by making yourself the best player that you can be, because you might get opportunities to go and play in overseas leagues. You might get opportunities to kind of make that kind of money, right? I think that's why it's so important. Like, they have an incentive now to kind of be the best. It all comes down, when you talk about the older players, I think it all comes down to the fact that there is no system where their places are under threat. These are the same girls who are dominating at club level, right? I've seen players like Anushka Sanjeevani bat in domestic cricket. She wrecks bowling attacks, right? So those are the same players who come to international cricket and struggle, but they don't have anybody competing for their places because the domestic system just doesn't have enough players, or enough players coming through from schools level, and that kind of system. So I'm hoping there is sort of a thing going on where at district level and provincial level they're looking to find players. I know SLC has a talent identification program for both boys and girls currently ongoing in the provincial level. So hopefully we will see a lot more of those players from different districts coming in and really pushing these type of the players who are currently in the national setup to step up their game, because that pressure isn't there. So like you said, they're content, or they seem content to kind of go to whatever competition and just compete. But I'm sure after yesterday's performance, they will be very disappointed, because that was just absolutely, I don't know what word is politically correct to use in this circumstance, but it was poor. It was just poor, the batting performance. So they need that kind of, I think they need that kind of competition for their spots, for them to really up their game.
Now it's time for our final break, and after that we will talk about what we can expect from Sri Lanka's final four, group stage matches at the Asia Cup.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
So Estelle, Sri Lanka have 4 more games left. Thailand, Malaysia, Bangladesh and Pakistan. I can't quite remember the order and I should have written it down, but I didn't. I'm used to having 2 screens, and currently where I am, I only have 1. What can we expect from these 4 games? Is it, as I kind of alluded to earlier, are we expecting wins against Thailand and Malaysia and then something quite competitive against Bangladesh and Pakistan, but probably not getting over the line. That's what I would suspect from what we've seen thus far. But what's your take on it?
Yeah, they'd be expecting to beat Malaysia and Thailand. I hope the game against UAE is kind of a kick up the backside that they needed, because I'm going to say it again, that was really poor batting performance. So hopefully that kind of sparks something in the side. I want to see this team winning without Atapattu's contribution with the bat, right? And that's the one thing that's going to give them confidence. So maybe they will also be confident going in against Bangladesh, because they do have a very good record against the Tigers. But Bangladesh in these conditions, I'm sure you've seen, like, the tracks are not tracks where you would expect teams to get to that 170, 180 run mark consistently. So Bangladesh in those conditions is a very dangerous side. I think they've got a good record coming into the tournament as well, where they've had to kind of play qualifiers for the World Cup, etc. And I don't think they're too happy about it, because they feel like they've proven themselves over the last couple of years. But that should be a tough encounter for Sri Lanka. They'll want to kind of get over the line against those three teams. And against Pakistan, again, it's going to be really difficult, like it was against India. Pakistan have had the better of Sri Lanka in the recent past. But on the day, I mean, again, I want to see them win without Atapattu making too much with the bat. But you've got to think that, I mean, it's going to be tough without her to beat a team like Pakistan, who've kind of done well, our team that's on the rise in international cricket. So 3 wins would be kind of what you would expect. But best case scenario, we'd have 4.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting. We haven't talked about Charmari much in this episode. Obviously, we did a whole episode about how her greatness, that you can go check out on the app or on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. But it does feel like she's yet to kind of make her big splash in this tournament, and we got to suspect that will come. Though I also suspect that when you prepare to play Sri Lanka, your first question is, how do you cope with it? Obviously, India, how do you cope with Charmari? What do you do to stop her scoring big runs? And obviously for India and the UAE, their plans paid off pretty early on and, stunted Sri Lanka's run scoring ability. Estelle, let's leave it there. Thanks for listening to Sri Lanka 99.94 Cricket every day. Please rate, review and subscribe. Download the 99.4 app and follow us personally. I'm on Twitter at Mark Machado. Estelle is at Estelle_Vasu_Day1, as in the number 1. We put links for everything we do there on this podcast and beyond. Also follow our network at 99.94 on social media. Follow for podcasts and commentary from the bat and ball world. Thanks for joining Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. We speak cricket.